Okay, so let's get going. Hi, guys. I hope everyone's doing well. So, we are going to be talking about taxes this week, and I really think that this is important. Some of you have actually been asking about this because it actually will be a pretty good lesson, I think, for many of you on how taxes work, what to expect when you are um, filing your taxes, things like that. So, this week is kind of interesting. I'm going to kind of combine a bunch of stuff where we're going to do personal finance, where we're actually looking at tax forms. I think this was really the last personal finance stuff that I wanted to do this year, and it's just a perfect time to do it because there's a lot of stuff going on with tax related things that we could talk about a little bit, but also just how taxes work and what to expect out of them, and how when you eventually do get a job and you are paying taxes, where does that money go to? How is it spent? So that way, when you guys do pay taxes, while it is no fun for anybody, I think it is important to realize that taxes are essential. They are essential to the functioning of our society. And if we didn't have taxes, there would be a lot of things that we would want as people that we would not get. Taxes are something that you pay to the government where it's a collective good that you are paying into. You are part of an overall society where there are things that we cannot afford as individuals. They're just too expensive. So we group things together in order to pay for them. We group money together in order to pay for those goods and services. There are a lot of things that you look out in your life that are paid by the taxes that you pay when you either go shopping to a restaurant. When you are paid yourself, you are paying taxes. There's a whole bunch of different times in your life where you just realize, oh my gosh, like why am I paying this much extra to buy this thing or whatever product or whatever service that you're buying. And that's not uncommon for people to be like, well, what am I paying this towards? What is this doing for me? And really, there's a lot. If you weren't paying taxes, there's a very good chance that we wouldn't have highways, that we wouldn't have roads, that we wouldn't have stoplights, that we wouldn't have a transportation system. If you take the RT, that's a great example. You wouldn't be able to do that. You wouldn't be able to take the RT because all of your, you cannot pay for that as an individual. That's just way too expensive. So when you pool all that money together, that's where you can start paying for a lot of things that we need in our everyday life. So when people talk about how we shouldn't need taxes or all this other stuff, I don't agree with that because it's just there's so many things that we don't realize that we need in our everyday life that you would need to have in like just as a basic need in service. So the government basically pulls all this money together and they make a revenue off of the taxes. That revenue goes towards different things. And the way that our tax bracket or the way that our stuff is structured in the United States is that we have a full tax bracket where you have different levels of when you make a certain amount of money, then your percentage you pay to that. So we're going to talk about this in a little bit in personal finance, but this also just is everyday stuff for taxes. And this is how our tax bracket works. And I'll probably post something so that way you guys can see it. But these are our tax brackets. This is the way that most people, like when you make a certain amount of money, this is what it looks like. So you only pay 10% tax if you make less than about $970,000, $9,700. And then there's different ways when you're looking at this. The way that this is kind of done is you're single means that you are a single individual. That does not mean if you are in a relationship that you file taxes together. That's actually a really bad idea. You file it separately. Until you are married, that's when you actually become a joint couple. When you're married, you can file your taxes together because you're making one income in one household, or at least that's what people think, right? You're making one household income. So when you're married, you pay a little bit more in tax. You pay 900. It's the same amount actually, but you are filing together. So if you make $20,000, less than $20,000 as a couple, you basically are going to be paying 10% in tax. If you're married, you can also file separately. Like let's say there's just you don't want to pay as much in tax. Like both your incomes together make too much money for you to pay altogether. So you decide, hey, we're going to file separately because we are married, but we want to kind of like not pay as much in taxes. So like let's say when we go over the bracket, you'll see this. But let's say you're making like your spouse is making like let's say $50,000, and you're making about $50,000, okay, a year. So you both are making that. If you file together, you would be paying more in taxes. But if you filed separately, you would be paying less. So you're like, okay, we're going to file separately because we're paying a lot less than we would if we were to file jointly. So that makes a difference. That's a huge thing for a lot of people, that they want to make sure that they're not paying too much in taxes. So that's why they do that. Then there's the head of households. So the way the head of household status works, that is the last tax bracket or the last type of joint you can have. When you are a head of household, but you have like a child or a dependent, or you're unmarried for the year or anything like that, then you are considered the only single person who is making money and is able to make money in the family, but you are taking care of somebody. So you're going to pay less in taxes. Usually, like you're going to have, unless you meet a certain taxable threshold, then you're going to be paying less in taxes. So that's what that means. So let's look at what all these different brackets percentages go over. So if you are making less than basically $40,000 a year, you are going to be paying 12% in taxes. And that's if you're single. Then if you're married, file separately, and then head of household stuff. That is all. If you're making less than $40,000 a year separately, you're probably going to be paying about $12,000. And then again, this is overall not what you are taxed, but what you make. And then it goes to 22%, so it's a huge jump when it comes to $40,000. When you make above $40,000, basically, same thing. It just has a huge jump. Then there's a little bit of a bump when you go from $84,000 to $160,000. That's basically the range you're paying 24% tax. That's the majority of people are paid between 22 and 24% in taxes in the United States. That is more than. That is pretty much like the average that people are going to be paying. You're paying 22 or 24%. The next one is 32%. This is that's a huge jump. When you make above $160,000, that's when you start getting into like basically upper middle class to like upper class people who are paying that amount of taxes because it's just they're making that much money. So they are going to be paying more in taxes and more in income. That's why there's a lot of people who, when they are making a certain amount of money, if you get to a point where you're either making like $100,000 and then you try to go up to $200,000, like you got to really look and see if it's worth it to even move it because you might be paying more taxes because of that. So they try to incentivize people. If you're making $100,000, that's great, but they try to incentivize people to make a certain amount more, so that way they're not paying that much more in tax, basically. But then if you make above $200,000 and between $500,000, you're paying 35%, and then anything above $500,000 and above is you are considered paying 37% in taxes. That's a lot of money. That's a good chunk of change. And then on top of that too, that's not even paying state taxes or anything like that. So it's a lot that you could be paying into your state to your federal tax bracket. I think they maybe have adjusted it for the new year. Yeah, that was for 2019. So this is for 2020. It's a little bit different. They raised it up a couple $100 for each tax bracket, but it's basically the same. Wherever your income level is, that's kind of where it's going to be, where you're going to be paying those taxes. So that's how taxes work in terms of how they're bracketed out. We're going to go over this during the personal finance stuff on Thursday, but I thought it was a good way, at least for you guys to see that this is how it works, that this is a progressive tax. As you start going up in income level, you're going to be paying more in how much tax you pay. There's also different ways to do it. There's proportional tax too. Some countries do this where no matter how much money you're making, you're paying the same amount. So like, let's say if you're making $100,000 a year, you're paying 6% in tax, but you're paying more because you make more money, right? If you're paying, let's say $40,000 a year, you're still paying 6% in tax. So the tax amount stays the same, but it just like how much you're paying just depends on how much money you're making. So it's a little bit different. And then there's the last one, which is regressive tax, which is the percentage of income that you pay towards taxes decreases as you make more money. And the reason they do that, like sales tax is a good example. When you have a lot of money, you're paying the same amount of tax as everybody else when you buy like a product, for example. When you go to the store and you're buying food, they're not going to look up your income level, and then you're going to pay more taxes because of that, right? But the taxes affect them less because they're just making more money, right? If a person who makes $100,000 a year is paying, 30 cents on a vegetable item, right, or something like that, they're paying like 30 cents tax on it. That's different than somebody who's only making like $10,000 a year, because that 30 cents can make a big difference in that person's life, especially when you're buying multiple of something, right? So that regressive tax also is a part of that too. We have different ways that we do taxes around the United States and how we tax people. There's different places that you'll pay into, that you pay for. On Thursday, we're going to go over and look at when you look at a paycheck and how to actually break down what are you paying in taxes every time that you get a paycheck, and then how you fill out your W-2s too, and how all that works and what it does and how the process actually works itself out. So there's four different qualities of taxes that really make it either a good tax or a bad tax. The first one is simplicity. To be honest, taxes can be kind of confusing at times. So the easier it is for people to understand it, the easier it is for the government to make sure it gets money in return. Efficiency is also an important thing. If it's inefficient to collect money from people, then it's going to be really hard for the government to do their jobs. And then on top of that, for them to make money in order to do that job. That's the whole point. So efficiency is really important. It needs to be there needs to be a system and a process in place that everyone knows that is a part of that society, and they know when they need to pay something and at what time they need to pay it. There's also needs to be certainty, meaning that if somebody is going to be paying taxes, they need to know how to pay it, how much they're paying it, and not be bogged down by other stuff too. So certainty is really important. You need to be certain that the money that you are paying is going to be good, that you're not going to owe anything else, and then on top of that, that you're going to have certainty that that's going towards something too. If people were uncertain of where their taxes were going to, which sometimes you are, most of the time you are, but you just have to assume that the money that you're putting in is going towards something, and that's why it's really important that we have an open society that tells us what are we spending our money on. And the last one is equity, meaning that people shouldn't be only the burdens of the tax program. And this is probably the one that I think most people are concerned about now, is that we have a society now that in which we reward people who make a lot of money and don't have to pay as much in taxes in terms of how much of a percent that they're making. A lot of people pay taxes another way. If you donate to a charity, for example, you can get a tax break on a lot of this stuff. You can get a tax break on the things that you're doing in your like to a charity or anything like that. So tax breaks are really important for people. And when you do have a tax break, when you give to a charity, you can write that off, meaning that you can put it towards a charitable cause, and the government will say, well, since you put it towards a charitable cause, you won't have to pay as much as you would in taxes. There's also loopholes that people get around. Tax loopholes happen all the time, and people for years have been trying to cut them off or make them simpler for everybody to kind of get a hold of. But there's a lot of people who are very, very wealthy who do not pay almost zero in actual tax to the federal government. And they pay it in different ways. That's not meaning that they're not paying other money in different ways, but there's ways that they can shift their money around that make sure that it's not just going to the federal government, it's going to other places too. So people say that that's either a good or a bad thing. A lot of the tax burden that we actually have goes on the middle class because most people are paying that amount of money and don't have the means. They have the means to live and live well and have a good life, but they don't have the means to find a loophole or pay people to find loopholes for them or to give a lot in charity. So they still are probably the most burdened part of this whole tax bracket system. So the way that the government works when it is trying to trying to collect taxes is when you actually work and you get your paycheck, the government is taking more money than it's probably going to need. Meaning that however much money you make, the government's going to look and be like, okay, we're taking this amount of money right away. That they need to have a certain amount, because if people just got all that money to start with, everybody would spend it everywhere. So part of what the government does is they say, okay, we're going to take this amount out. And then what happens is, and this is what we're going to be going over, when you do your taxes, the reason why you get money back from the government is because either if you paid too much money into that system, the government's going to look at you and go, okay, you paid this amount of money into the system already. Now we're going to give you this money back because we took too much. So let's say, for example, you made $50,000 a year, and you're in the, I think, 22% tax bracket. So what's 22% of 50? We're doing this. It's $11,000. Okay, so $11,000 in actual taxes that you are paying. So really, you're taking home probably about $39,000 of actual income that you are making. So you, over the course of that time, will need to pay $11,000 into the federal government. So let's say you paid $11,000. You paid $12,000 because you put more tax money into the system, and weren't really realizing it, but that's how much money you were paying into. What the government's going to do is going to be like, okay, you paid $12,000, so we're going to give you $1,000 back because you only owe us $11,000. So that's where you get your tax return. That's why people get money back from the government, because they are getting their tax returned to them. The other side of it, though, let's say you only paid $10,000 into you set up your tax stuff where you only paid $10,000 into it. If you found no other way to do it, the government's going to be like, okay, you owe us $1,000 then. So that's when you owe the government money, because you need to hit that $11,000 that you need to pay in taxes, right? So that's how taxes really work, is that you are giving and receiving money from the government back and forth. And when all is said and done, when the year is done, they look at everything and they go, okay, how much money do you owe, and do we owe you anything? That's how the government really works at it. So they guarantee that they're going to get our tax money first, because if you got that money back and then they all said at the end of the year, hey, you owe us $11,000, a lot of people would not be able to pay that. A ton of people would not be able to, because they go and spend it. It's the way that human beings work. If they get a bunch of money, they're more likely going to go spend it on things that they need, and that's just the way it is. So the government, in order to make sure that they're functioning, takes that out first and then gives you stuff later, or asks you for more later on if you need to owe more. So we're going to go over more of what taxes you actually pay when you do your paycheck. We're going to talk about it on Thursday, so I won't go over that now. So the last thing that we're going to talk about is, what does that tax money go towards? Taxes really go towards everything that you would, like everyday life stuff that you just don't even notice, that, it's just a part of your life, and you're like, okay, yeah, it's a part of it and it is what it is. But you don't really notice it unless you really study how taxes work. So a couple things that it does go towards is entitlement programs. So Social Security is one of those things. When you get older, this is going to be one of those things. Hopefully Social Security is still around at that point. But Social Security is really important because when you retire, people who retire or older usually can't make much money, and they're not part of the workforce anymore. They're done. They've either worked for a very long time and they're very tired and they want to retire, and they're older, so they just go and retire. They're not working anymore, right? But they still need to live and still need to have something. So Social Security is a good way to make sure that when people do retire, they have a basic income that they can turn to be like, okay, this is what I'm paying money towards. And that is what Social Security goes to. So we pay tax into that throughout our life in order to make sure when we do retire that we have something when we're older to look at. The next one is Medicare. So Medicare is a healthcare system for those who are very, very vulnerable. It again pays for people who are usually a little bit older. Sometimes Medicare also goes towards some younger people, but it's basically a healthcare system designed to pay for healthcare for those who are very, very old, and that's an essential need, especially as you get older. And you don't make that much money, especially on Social Security. You need to have the ability to pay for that healthcare, especially as you get older, when a lot of your health just starts deteriorating, right? So that is a portion of Medicare that's really important. Medicaid is another one. So Medicaid is for lower income families who usually have a child with disabilities or a person with disabilities or anything like that. Medicaid is a good way for people to fall back on if they really need help with things that are just overwhelmingly going to be expensive to do. First off, expensive like therapy or anything like that. Medicaid is a way to get that covered. I'm sure many of you have probably either heard or know people who have used Medicaid or Medicare, because it's very, very common for people who are older or people who are disabled or people who just are very, very sick to turn to these systems in case they need it. We do these entitlement programs because if we didn't have these in place, many, many people would die. Many people who were very sick would not get help that they needed, and because it's very expensive in our country for healthcare. And when you have that system and you don't have the ability to take care of people, a lot of people are going to die. So we set up an entitlement program in order to make sure people had that backup that they needed. Taxes also pay for child nutrition programs, food stamps. If you guys ever have gone, like people who are on welfare, a whole bunch of different things. Like you just, if you really think about all the government programs that they cover, there's a whole bunch of different things that taxes pay for. Every government worker that you have, the DMV, that's state stuff, but that's state tax too. States have taxes as well. California does. California state tax pays for that too. We also have defense spending. When you have any military plane, any boat, anything like that, or any missile defense or anything like that is paid for by taxes. If we pay more money into it, that's where most of our money is spent. And the question is, and this is what we're going to get into when we talk about fiscal policy, is what is the responsibility of government to provide different things to different people? Your federal student loans are another thing. That is another one. If you have applied for federal student loans, a lot of those are paid for by taxpayers who are paying for you to go to college. You are federally giving, that's a loan, which is a little bit different than just, a government spending thing. This is why this is super important to realize how much taxes actually affect our everyday life, and we might not even know it. So as you guys start looking over the assignments that we have for this week, I want you to really think about, okay, taxes are never fun. I'm not telling you that. Taxes are definitely not fun. But what things do I think are really important to spend money on? What kind of federal spending do I think is important that I would want to make sure that stays in place and that I prioritize? As you start getting older, you start knowing things start becoming more important to you in terms of money that's being spent certain places and where it's being spent, and especially as you start getting jobs and things like that, you're going to want to know where those things are spent. So I would tell you this week to really look at that, and as we go into it, as we start really looking through it, I think this is a good time for everybody to kind of really ask, okay, what do I prioritize? What are the things that I care about that I want to see continue to be funded as I start getting older and as I start looking at jobs, and where do I want my taxes to go to? So, all right, guys, so that is it for me. I am going to hopefully be getting out a lot of what you need to do this week. You have a couple assignments. Again, Wednesday and Thursday will be your major assignments. I'm still exactly working on what those are going to be, so hopefully, at least you guys will look through them. Make sure that if you have any questions about anything on them, let me ask and we'll talk about it. We'll see if there's something that maybe I can go for. Your Friday assignment will probably be a personal finance thing, but your Wednesday assignment will be basically going over this and talking about federal spending and what you care about as somebody who is going to be a taxpayer in this country at some point. So, all right, guys, I hope you guys are doing well. I miss you all. I will talk to you all soon.